Hey, what's up, everyone? Hope you're doing well. I've been chewing on the patch notes for Crossout's small November update 4.5, and I want to walk you through everything that changed, why it matters, and what the ripples will look like across builds and matches. The devs shipped a handful of focused fixes rather than sweeping balance shifts, but those focused fixes touch some very sensitive mechanics: movement perks, perk charge counting, and a few visual and recipe tweaks. So even though the patch is small, the practical impact can be surprisingly broad. First off, the MVP Torpedo air cushion got patched to stop overly accelerating vehicles. There was a bug that allowed the movement part to produce unintended bursts of acceleration, and the fix brings its behavior back to what the designers intended: smoother, more predictable handling rather than sudden, exploit-like speed spikes. Mechanically, that's important because any part that changes momentum or handling has cascading effects. It affects how quickly you can reposition, how reliably perks that depend on speed trigger, and whether you can close or escape fights without being punished by physics inconsistencies. For builders who've been enjoying the quirky acceleration, expect a more stable, controllable experience instead of unpredictable zips across the map. The update also improved the visual effect for the MVP Torpedo's air cushion moving along the surface, which sounds cosmetic, but helps you read what the part is doing in the heat of battle. A subtle but meaningful change is that the MVP Torpedo perk description now explicitly mentions an efficiency decrease when mounted alongside other movement parts. That interaction apparently existed before, but the tooltip didn't make it clear. Now that the description matches the mechanic, you'll stop seeing weird discrepancies between how your vehicle should perform on paper and what it actually does in a match. In practice, this means multi-movement setups, the kind where you chain different locomotion parts to chase a hybrid of speed and control, need to be considered in light of this efficiency penalty. The takeaway isn't that you can't mix movers, just that the math is now explicit, which will make build theory crafting more reliable. Perk charge counting got some much-needed tightening up. Two cases were mentioned. Shots from Charon with an active perk were sometimes counted toward perk charge accumulation, and destroyer-charged grenades could also incorrectly count. Those were bugs, and they're fixed. That matters because perk charge mechanics are core to how you time engagements. A gun or grenade that charges too quickly or too slowly compared to its description completely changes a weapon's role. So if you had matches where your perk didn't trigger when you expected it to, or conversely, where it felt like it charged for free, those anomalies should be resolved now. Expect your timing windows to be more consistent and your burst windows to behave like the tooltips imply. There was also an improvement to the collision model of the hybrid machine gun. Collision tweaks are one of those low-level changes that can silently shift the meta. They alter which tiny components are viable as shot magnets, which angles are safe to peek from, and how reliably small hitboxes register damage. If you've been building around precise pokes with the hybrid, then you'll want to be aware that shot registration might be slightly different. Not a stat change on the gun itself, but a change in how the environment interacts with it. For streamers and content creators, this can be one of the more noticeable differences because it affects the aesthetics of gunplay and the satisfaction of hits connecting. Item recipes and workbench upgrades saw a small but juicy change. The upgraded starter at the season workbench had its durability upgrade replaced by a mass 17% modifier. That's a direct boon for low PS and tight weight builds, because shaving mass opens up space for either an extra weapon, sturdier armor, or simply better mobility without bumping PS too much. In the sort of experimental wiggle room builds where every kilo counts, a mass reduction like this can be the difference between a viable light frame and something that's forced to compromise. So while it's not a damage buff, it's absolutely a practical buff for certain classes of builds. What does all this mean for the match level meta? On one level, it's a stabilization patch. Speed exploits and perk count inconsistencies are being corrected, so the game's behavior should line up more tightly with developer intent. That tends to favor players who value predictability in engagements, aiming for windows where perks reliably pop, or wanting movement that responds the same way from match to match. On another level, a few groups of builds need reevaluation. MVP, torpedo-centered speedsters, hybrid multi-movement rigs, Charon destroyer perk-reliant loadouts, and pinpoint aim builds around the hybrid. None of these got one-shot nerfed. Rather, the environment they operate in got cleaned up, which means some of the fringe effectiveness that came from bugs will disappear while legitimate skill-based advantages remain. There's also a psychological and community angle worth mentioning. Small, well-targeted fixes like these show the devs are actively maintaining the integrity of core systems. Patch notes aren't always glamorous, but when the fixes address things that felt off to players, weird perk triggers, unpredictable momentum, invisible efficiency penalties, those fixes can restore faith in competitive fairness and make experimental builds more transparent. Expect forum threads and subreddit posts to pick apart specific interactions now that the tooltips and mechanics line up. Players who test builds in depth we'll be keen to point out where small advantages used to exist and why those were removed. So yeah, the patch is short on new toys, but long on quality of play improvements. Visual tweaks, corrected perk counting, clearer tooltips, a mass reduction on a common starter upgrade, and a fix for overt acceleration add up to an experience that should feel more consistent and fair. For folks who love to theorycraft, that's good news. Predictable systems are the soil where interesting builds grow. For everyone else, it simply means fewer what just happened moments in the middle of a fight. That's the breakdown. Focused, practical, and likely to make matches feel cleaner, even if nothing world-shattering was changed.